Hello, friends, and welcome back to another interesting and thought-challenging video on Learn Easy Way. I hope all of you are doing well and feeling inspired today. First of all, thank you so much for the incredible love and support you've shown for our previous videos. It really inspires us to keep going. Today, we're bringing you a story that's full of love, courage, and life lessons. It's one of those tales that will stay with you long after it's over. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. You're going to love this. Part 1. A Lonely Childhood. Imagine being born into a world of riches, but feeling like the loneliest person alive. That was Prince Edward's life. Born in 1894, he grew up surrounded by luxury in one of the grandest palaces in the world, but happiness was nowhere to be found. His father, King George V, was a towering figure who seemed more like a shadow than a dad. "Why can't Edward stay quiet?" the king would grumble. "He talks too much. What a noisy child." Edward's mother, Queen Mary, wasn't any warmer. She didn't care if Edward smiled or cried. "It doesn't matter if he's happy or sad," she'd say. "A child must be silent and strong." The family lived in Buckingham Palace, an enormous home with 600 rooms. It boasted 8 kitchens, 19 bathrooms, 24 toilets, 11 dining rooms, 17 bedrooms, and 21 sitting rooms. Despite its grandeur, the palace often felt more like a maze than a home. Edward once recalled a humorous, yet frustrating incident that highlighted just how vast the palace was. One evening, Edward, his mother, and his father sat waiting in the dining room for their dinner. Minutes ticked by, but no food arrived. After 20 minutes, the king grew furious. He stormed into the kitchen, shouting, "Where is the cook? And where is my dinner?" "But, sir," the cook replied nervously, "your dinner left the kitchen 15 minutes ago. Hasn't it reached you yet?" "No, it hasn't," the king bellowed, "and I'm starving." The king set off to find the missing meal himself. 10 minutes later, he spotted a servant carrying 3 plates of meat and potatoes. "What took you so long?" he demanded. "Why didn't you bring us our dinner?" "I'm sorry, sir," the woman stammered. "There are so many dining rooms here, I got lost. But if you return to your table, I'll follow you to the right room this time." Despite living in one of the most magnificent homes in England, Edward's days were filled with loneliness. Unlike other children, he didn't attend school. Instead, he studied in a private classroom within the palace. Reflecting on his education, Edward described it as dull and punishing. "My teacher, Mr. Hansel, was a thin, stern man with a red nose. He never smiled, and our lessons were painfully boring. The books were packed with words, but had no pictures to make them interesting. Sometimes, I'd stop reading and gaze out the window, dreaming of something better. But whenever I did, Mr. Hansel would grab a stick and hit me on the arm. 'Don't look out the window, boy,' he'd shout. 'Focus on the book.' My arm turned red from all the hits. Every Friday, Mr. Hansel reported to the king about Edward's progress, or lack thereof. 'Well, what has my son learned this week?' the king would ask. The answer was always the same. 'Not much, I'm afraid, sir.' Edward doesn't pay attention, and he shows no interest in his studies. After these meetings, the king would scold Edward harshly. 'What's wrong with you, child?' he'd snap. 'Are you stupid? Why can't you learn anything?' 'But the lessons are so boring, father,' Edward would reply timidly. 'And Mr. Hansel hurts me.' 'You're weak, Edward,' the king retorted. 'You'll never make a good king. A king must be strong. Go to your room and stay there until morning. Years later, Edward wrote about those painful memories. I spent countless days alone in my room. I never played with other children or made friends. Though I lived in one of the most beautiful houses in England, I was constantly lonely and unhappy. I saw my mother only once a day during dinner, and my father 3 or 4 times a week. Yet they never showed me love. I was terrified of them, and everything I did seemed to disappoint them. Part 2. The Prince of Wales. In the spring of 1911, Edward's life took a dramatic turn. One day, King George called him into his room and announced, "Next month I will make you the Prince of Wales. These are your clothes for the ceremony." The king opened a small cupboard to reveal the outfit Edward was expected to wear. Edward stared at it in disbelief and burst into tears. "But father," he protested, "I'm 16 years old now. I can't wear soft shoes and a skirt. I'll look like a girl. Why can't I dress like everyone else?" "Because you're different and special," his father replied firmly, "and one day you'll be king." Edward spent the next 2 days crying, but there was nothing he could do to change his father's mind. On June 10, 1911, the royal family traveled to Caernarvon Castle in North Wales for the grand ceremony. The castle was filled with music, dancing, and cheering crowds. As part of the ritual, King George placed a small gold crown on Edward's head. But instead of feeling proud, Edward felt miserable. Closing his eyes, he whispered to himself, "I feel terrible. Can we go home now?" "Not yet," the king said sharply. "The people want to see you." Edward reluctantly walked to the front of the castle and looked down at the sea of faces below. His hands trembled and his face turned bright red. He hated every moment of it. "Smile, Edward," the king commanded. "You are happy." Hours later, as the family drove back to Windsor, Queen Mary remarked cheerfully, "Wasn't that a lovely day?" Edward didn't respond. He silently removed his uncomfortable shoes and gazed out the window, thinking to himself, "Never again. Never again." Part 3. The Royal Star. After spending a year studying at Oxford University, Edward joined the military to fight in the First World War. Reflecting on his experiences, he later wrote, "I lived in a house with 25 other soldiers. At night, we'd sit around talking about our lives, families, and dreams. It was fascinating to meet people from all walks of life, rich and poor, young and old. For the first time, I could speak freely without worrying about titles or rules. But I also witnessed the horrors of war, the blood, the noise, the suffering." One day in 1916, Edward visited the town of Loos in Belgium. He stepped out of his car and climbed to the top of a hill. From there, he watched the chaos of battle raging below. The sight filled him with sadness. An hour later, he returned to his vehicle only to discover a heartbreaking scene. His driver lay dead, shot in the neck while Edward had been away. This moment left a deep scar on his heart. When the war ended in 1918, Edward returned to Buckingham Palace. One evening, he sat with his father in the dining room, sharing his thoughts. "I don't understand why countries fight," Edward said passionately. "The war is over, but nothing has changed. Millions of people are still poor and hungry. It's not right. Someone must do something." King George listened quietly before responding. "You can't change the world by sitting by the fire," he advised. "You must travel, meet people, talk to them, Listen to their stories, and when you become king, you'll have the power to make the world a better place. Taking his father's advice to heart, Edward set off on a global journey in 1920. Over the next 5 years, he traveled an incredible 240,000 kilometers and visited 45 countries, including India, Argentina, Nigeria, Mexico, New Zealand, Germany, and Japan. Wherever he went, massive crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of him. In Toronto, Canada, 500,000 people lined the streets to welcome him. Similar scenes unfolded elsewhere. 190,000 in Cape Town, 300,000 in Paris, 500,000 in New York, and an astonishing 750,000 in Melbourne. Newspapers hailed him as the first royal star. One article described him this way: "In the old days, princes were cold and distant. But Edward is different. He steps out of his car and walks among the people. Every few minutes, he stops to chat, laugh, and smile. He shakes thousands of hands. He is truly a man of the people, with a heart of gold." Through his travels, Edward realized that connecting with ordinary people brought him joy and gave him hope for a brighter future. Part 4. The Meeting. In the autumn of 1930, Edward decided to spend a weekend with his friends Lord and Lady Furness. In his book, A King's Story, he described that fateful day in vivid detail. On Saturday, the weather was cold and windy, with heavy rain pouring down. Riding horses was out of the question, so everyone stayed indoors and gathered for an early lunch with some of Lady Furness's guests. At 1 o'clock, Wallis Simpson arrived with her husband. She was elegantly dressed, her smile lighting up the room. After exchanging a few words with Lord Furness, Lady Furness introduced her to Edward. "Sir, I'd like you to meet one of my dearest and sweetest American friends, Mrs. Wallis Simpson," she said warmly. "How do you do, Mrs. Simpson?" Edward greeted politely. "Please come and sit down." As Lady Furness stepped away, Edward and Wallis began to chat. Edward noticed that Wallis seemed unwell. Her eyes were red, and she had a bad cold. "I'm afraid our English houses aren't very warm," he remarked gently. "We don't have American central heating here." There was a long pause. Wallis turned her head and gazed out the window before replying, "You've disappointed me, sir." "And why is that?" Edward asked, surprised. "Because everyone asks me about American central heating," she explained. "I thought the Prince of Wales would talk about something more interesting." Edward burst into laughter. "What's so funny, sir?" Wallis asked curiously. "Have I said something wrong?" "No," he replied, still smiling. "I'm laughing because you didn't lie to me. You told me the truth." "But why is that funny? Doesn't everyone tell the truth?" "One day, I'll be King of England," Edward said seriously. "And people are afraid of me. If I say the sky is yellow, they agree. If I claim Wednesday is the first day of the week, they nod. And if I insist Scotland is bigger than Canada, they say, 'Yes, sir, you're right.' But you called me boring. You spoke the truth. I like that." Another silence followed, and then Wallis laughed too. "May I say one more thing, sir?" "Yes, Mrs. Simpson. What is it?" "It's your trousers, sir." "My trousers?" "Yes, sir. They're black and your shoes are brown. Those two colors don't go well together." Edward stood up and glanced at himself in the mirror. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Simpson. I look ridiculous. The next time we meet, I promise to dress better." When lunch was served, they moved to the dining room. Edward sat at one end of the table, while Wallace took her place at the other. Throughout the meal, Edward found himself watching her closely. He admired her graceful hands and listened intently as she spoke with Lady Furness. A few minutes later, she turned and smiled at him, and Edward felt a wave of happiness wash over him. After lunch, Wallace approached to bid farewell. "My husband and I must leave now, sir. We're attending another party in London." Edward wanted to say something meaningful, but the words escaped him. Instead, they shook hands, and Wallace walked away. Edward joined Lady Furness in the next room. "Tell me about Mrs. Simpson," he asked eagerly. "What would you like to know?" Lady Furness asked. "Everything," Edward replied without hesitation. Lady Furness suggested they take a walk in the garden, where they could talk more freely. As they strolled among the trees, she began sharing Wallace's story. Part 5. Wallace. This is how Lady Furness recounted Wallace's early life to Edward. Wallace was born in Baltimore. Her father passed away when she was just 5 months old, leaving her mother to raise her alone. Despite the loss, Wallace grew up happy under her mother's care. When she was 20, she married a man named Winfield Spencer. At first, their marriage seemed perfect, but one evening, everything changed. Winfield lost some money on the street and came home furious. Grabbing a bottle of whiskey, he began drinking heavily. That night, he struck Wallace in the mouth. She screamed, but he hit her again. Blood streamed down her face and she trembled uncontrollably. "Please, Winfield," she begged. "No more." Ignoring her pleas, Winfield dragged her upstairs, shouting, "You're my prisoner, and you're not leaving." He shoved her into the bathroom and locked the door. The next morning, Wallace fled to her family. "I can't stay with him," she declared firmly. "I want a divorce." Edward listened intently, his heart aching for Wallace. "Poor Wallace," he murmured. But what happened next? "Well," Lady Furness continued, "a few months later she met a kind and thoughtful man named Ernest Simpson. They fell in love and got married. Now they live in a beautiful apartment in central London." "And are they happy?" Edward inquired. Lady Furness hesitated, then smiled mysteriously. "I don't know, sir. I don't know." Over the next 2 years, Edward saw Wallace once or twice a week. They shared mutual friends and frequently crossed paths at social gatherings. Mrs. Simpson knew a great deal about life, Edward later recalled. She loved books, food, travel, and people. She was stunningly beautiful, with fiery eyes that captivated everyone around her. She was easy to talk to, and gradually I opened up to her completely. We shared everything. No secrets between us. That's how it all began. Wallace, too, reflected on Edward fondly. "His eyes always looked sad," she said. "Sometimes he seemed like a child, so young, so quiet, so vulnerable. He didn't have many real friends, perhaps because people were intimidated by him. But beneath it all, he was warm and kind. When he spoke to me, my heart raced. I wanted to be alone with him, but I knew that wasn't possible." Did the prince love me back then? No, I don't think so. But each time we met, we grew closer and closer. In June 1933, Edward hosted a birthday party for Wallace. Over the following months, he visited the Simpsons' London flat almost daily. One evening, Edward invited Wallace and Ernest to join him on a skiing trip to Austria. "I'm sorry, sir," Ernest replied. "I have business in America, but perhaps Wallace and her aunt could accompany you." "We went to Kitzbühel as friends," Wallace wrote later, "but when we returned, we were in love. A few months later, the prince asked me to marry him. It felt like a dream." Part 6. The King is Dead. Long Live the King. In January 1936, Edward decided to spend a few weeks at Windsor. He was tired of city life and wanted to relax by working in his garden and riding his horses. One afternoon, the phone rang. It was Queen Mary. "Edward," she said urgently, "you must come back immediately. Your father is very ill, and I fear he may not survive." Edward rushed back and went straight to his father's room. He walked to the bedside and gently kissed his father's pale face. The king opened his eyes, smiled weakly, and took Edward's hand. "Be a good king, Edward," he whispered, "and take care of your mother." "Yes, father, I will," Edward promised. The king closed his eyes and never spoke again. Just after midnight he passed away. Queen Mary then took Edward's hand and kissed it. "My child," she said softly, "you are now the king. May God be with you." Edward's 3 brothers came to him one by one. Each kissed his hand and said, "The king is dead. Long live the king." At 1 o'clock in the morning, Edward left the room to call Wallace. "My father has passed away," he told her. "I'm so sorry, sir," Wallace replied. "I need to stay here for a while," Edward continued, "but I'll call you this weekend. Nothing will change between us. I love you more than ever, and you will be my queen." "Let's not talk about that now," Wallace said gently. "You must focus on your family." "But you are my family, Wallace. You mean everything to me. Good night. Sleep well." When Wallace hung up the phone that night, she felt a sudden wave of fear. Edward is now the king, she thought. But what will happen to me? That's it for today's video, friends. I hope you enjoyed this incredible story as much as I loved sharing it with you. Trust me, the next part is even more exciting and full of surprises. You won't want to miss it. So make sure to check out part 2 for the continuation of this fascinating tale. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to English Tales for more amazing stories. See you in the next video.